Welcome to the Stellar Vault. Say hi in the comments to awaken the archive. Then like, subscribe, and let the tale begin.
The crate opened with a hiss of pressurized air, and Dren Calloway woke to blue light. Wrong light. His eyes burned. His throat felt packed with dry sand. He tried to lift his arm, and the limb responded slowly, trembling, disconnected from his intentions. Whatever they had used to sedate him still clung to his blood, dragging at his muscles, blurring the edges of his thoughts. He was lying on his side, cold metal beneath his cheek, the hum of machinery somewhere below him, vibrating through the floor of the crate. He could smell recycled air, sterile and flat. And beneath it something else. Soil, vegetation, water. Not the mining shaft. The last thing he remembered was Corin 4, the deep tunnels, the rumble that started in the walls and moved through the floor, and then the ceiling came down, and men were screaming, and he was running, and then darkness and pressure, and he could not breathe. And then nothing. Then nothing for a long time. Now this. The front panel of the crate slid away and light flooded in. Dren squinted against it, raising one hand to shield his face. His fingers were stiff, his joints ached. He did not know how long he had been unconscious. Days. Weeks. He could not tell. He forced himself to focus. Beyond the open panel, he saw a chamber. High ceilings. Smooth walls the color of pale stone. No windows. Ambient light came from everywhere and nowhere, diffused through the surfaces themselves. 10 meters ahead, something shimmered in the air. A barrier. He could see through it to a green space beyond, but the air between rippled like heat, rising from summer rock. And standing behind the barrier, watching, was the alien. Tall, taller than any human Dren had seen. Thin-limbed, with joints that bent at angles that seemed wrong. Gray-blue skin, mottled like weathered granite, smooth and hairless. 4 fingers on each hand, 2 of them opposable, folded in front of its narrow chest. A crest of rigid cartilage ran from its forehead over the crown of its skull to the back of its neck. The crest was still, flat. The alien's eyes were large, dark, unblinking. They watched Dren with the patient attention of someone observing an insect in a jar. Dren did not move. An automated platform beneath him hummed to life. He felt it shift under his weight, sliding him forward out of the crate. He let it carry him. He had no weapon. He had no knowledge of where he was. Fighting would achieve nothing except confirming whatever assumptions the creature had already made about him. Better to watch and learn. The platform carried him to the edge of the shimmering barrier and stopped. Behind him, the transport crate sealed itself and retracted into the floor with a mechanical whisper. Gone. No way back. A small device mounted near the barrier emitted a sound. Low, precise, syllables that meant nothing to Dren. Then a second voice, flat and artificial, translated. Enter. A section of the barrier parted. Just enough space for him to step through. Dren stood. His legs nearly buckled. He steadied himself, took a breath, and stepped through. The air changed immediately. Warmer. Humid. He smelled soil and growing things, chlorophyll and moisture, and the faint sweetness of flowers he did not recognize. The ground beneath his bare feet was soft, covered in short grass-like vegetation that bent under his weight. Ahead, the space opened into a circular enclosure perhaps 80 meters across. Vegetation clustered near a small stream that ran through the center. Rock formations rose at the perimeter, disguising what he assumed were the actual walls. A small structure waited near the middle of the space. 4 walls, a sloped roof, an opening for a door. Simple. Functional. A habitat. A cage built to look like a home, Dren turned and looked back. The barrier had sealed behind him, invisible again, just a shimmer in the air. The alien still stood on the observation deck above, motionless, crest flat, watching. Dren looked up at the sky, pale blue, seamless, no sun visible but light coming from everywhere. Artificial, controlled. He looked at the stream, the vegetation, the shelter. All of it designed, all of it provided. He was a specimen in a terrarium. He walked to the shelter without hurrying. The floor inside was padded with something soft and insulating. A thermal sheet lay folded in one corner. A dispenser was mounted in the wall. He touched it, and water flowed into a small basin. Clean. Cool. He drank. On the observation deck, Sithal Nur made his first entry in the personal log he would keep for this subject. Terran 7 delivered intact. Transit time, 14 standard days. Initial stress response minimal. Subject displays disorientation but no panic, no aggression, no vocalization. Immediate exploration of habitat suggests mapping instinct. We'll monitor integration period closely. He watched for another hour, hands folded. The human sat inside the shelter and did not move. Sithal Nur found this satisfactory. The days folded into each other, and Dren learned the shape of his world. He walked the perimeter every morning. 83 meters, he estimated, measured in paces he kept consistent. The rock formations at the edges were artificial, molded to look natural, but too smooth in places, too regular in their spacing. The barrier was invisible but present. He found it by holding his hand out as he walked, feeling for the resistance. It curved inward slightly at the top, forming a dome he could not see, but could sense when he looked up at certain angles and caught a faint distortion in the artificial light. The stream originated from a concealed source in the eastern rock wall. Water flowed through a channel in the floor, following a groove cut with mechanical precision, and drained into the western wall. The vegetation was thickest near the water, broad-leafed plants with purple undersides, grass that stayed short, as if trimmed by something he never saw, flowers that opened during the light cycle and closed when the sky dimmed. 3 feeding times each day. The dispenser in his shelter released nutrient blocks and a protein paste at regular intervals. The blocks were dense, flavorless, designed for sustenance rather than pleasure. The paste had a faint metallic undertaste. He ate everything provided. He did not know when it might stop. The alien visited the observation deck twice during the first week. Sithal Nur stood with his hands folded, crest flat, watching. Sometimes he held a device and made notes. Sometimes he simply observed, still as stone, for an hour or more before departing. Dren watched back. He learned to read the crest. It moved in subtle ways the alien probably did not realize were visible. A tilt forward meant focus, attention, interest. A slight rise at the edges meant surprise or uncertainty. A full flatten meant calm, satisfaction, control. Once, when a maintenance drone malfunctioned near the barrier and emitted a high-pitched sound, the crest flared sharply before settling back into place. Agitation, startle response, quick suppression. The alien had emotions. The alien believed it concealed them. Dren filed this away. He sat in his shelter and looked at nothing. Sithal Nur's log, Day 7. Subject has established consistent routines. Perimeter walks occur each morning, suggesting territorial mapping instinct, common in confined fauna. Feeding behavior normal. No attempts at barrier breach. No vocalization. No displays of distress or aggression. Temperament classification. Docile. Integration successful. On the 9th day, Dren woke, shivering. The temperature had dropped overnight. His breath misted in the air. The vegetation near his shelter had curled inward, leaves tightening against the cold. Frost glittered on the grass outside. He sat up and looked toward the observation deck. Empty. He checked the dispenser. It released the nutrient block on schedule. The paste was colder than usual, but still edible. He ate and considered his situation. The thermal sheet helped, but was not designed for this temperature. The shelter walls were thin, gaps between the panels where they did not quite meet. Wind slid through the openings, stealing warmth faster than his body could produce it. He could wait and hope the temperature returned to normal, or he could adapt. Dren stepped outside and began gathering materials. He started with the broad-leafed plants near the stream. He pulled them carefully, keeping the root structures intact, and carried armfuls back to the shelter. He packed them against the interior walls, layering them to cover the gaps, leaf over leaf, stem woven through stem, until the walls were insulated and the wind no longer cut through. The floor was harder. Cold seeped up from the ground itself, rising through the padding, settling into his bones when he tried to sleep. He needed to get off the ground. He walked the enclosure, looking for materials. Near the eastern rocks, he found a patch of dried moss growing in a crevice. He stripped it away in sheets and carried it back. Near the stream, he found fallen vegetation, leaves that had dried and curled. He gathered those too. In the shelter, he dug. His hands were not tools. The soil beneath the padding was compact, resistant. He scraped at it with his fingers, breaking his nails, raising blisters on his palms. Slow progress. Painful progress. But progress. By midday, he had hollowed out a pit the length of his body and the depth of his forearm. He lined it with the dried moss. He layered the fallen leaves on top. He covered it all with the thermal sheet and climbed in. Warmth, not comfort, not safety, but survival. He lay in his nest as the artificial sky dimmed toward night cycle, breathing slowly, letting his body heat fill the small space. The cold pressed against the walls of the shelter, but could not reach him. On the observation deck, Seth al-Nur reviewed the day's footage with mild interest. His crest tilted forward as he watched the human construct its nest. Insulation behavior, he noted in his log. Subject demonstrates practical adaptation to environmental change. No tools used. Construction relies on available organic materials arranged by hand. Behavior consistent with nesting instinct observed in several mammalian species. Adaptation within expected parameters. Seth al-Nur did not notice the stone. Dren had found it while digging. A fragment of rock, darker than the surrounding soil, wedged in the compacted earth. He had worked it free carefully, testing its weight in his palm. One edge was sharp, chipped in a way that might have been natural, or might have been intentional by some previous geological process. It fit in his hand. It could cut. He had slipped it beneath the bedding of his nest before the drone passed overhead. First tool. First secret. The cold persisted for 6 days, then eased. Seth al-Nur adjusted the environmental controls back to baseline and noted in his log that the subject had survived the temperature variance without requesting intervention. No distress signals, no behavioral degradation. Adaptation successful. He did not visit the observation deck that week. Other specimens required attention. The Terran was stable. Dren kept his nest. He reinforced it during the warm days, adding more insulation, deepening the pit, creating a space that would sustain him through any future adjustment. He continued his perimeter walks. He ate his nutrient blocks. He watched the drones and learned their patterns. 4 drones moved in rotating patterns, easy to track. The observation nodes were fixed, mounted on the rock formations at regular intervals around the enclosure. 9 of them, each with a lens that tracked movement within a specific arc. He mapped their coverage by walking slowly and watching for the subtle shift of lenses following him. Gaps existed, small blind spots, where the arcs did not quite overlap. He found the largest gap near the western drainage point. The stream flowed into a groove cut into the enclosure floor, engineered channels that carried water toward the perimeter wall. Where the groove met the rock formation, the observation node above was angled to cover the stream itself, not the base of the rocks. Dren crouched beside the drainage point, pretending to study the water. His eyes moved to the junction of floor and wall. A crack. Narrow. Barely visible unless you were looking for it. A seam where the artificial rock formation met the actual foundation of the enclosure. Natural stress fracture, perhaps. Or incomplete engineering. He placed his hand near the opening. Air moved through it. Cool air, damp, carrying a scent of deep stone. Not recycled, not part of the enclosure's controlled atmosphere. This air came from somewhere else. Somewhere below. Dren stood and walked back to his shelter. He did not look at the crack again that day. He ate. He drank. He sat and did nothing until the artificial light dimmed to darkness. He did not return to the crack that night. Or the next. He waited. Sethal Nur received a visitor a few days later. Another Othani, taller, older, with a crest lined by age and marked with the subtle coloring that indicated senior rank. Drothsel, from the Regional Assessment Bureau. He had come to inspect Sethal Nur's collection as part of routine credential review. They walked the estate together, moving from habitat to habitat, taking their time as they checked each one. Sethal Nur maintained a collection of 17 specimens from 11 worlds. Winged creatures from the gas layers of Methris 4, burrowing fauna from the desert moon of Sileth, aquatic specimens suspended in pressurized tanks, their bioluminescence pulsing in slow rhythms. Drothsel made appropriate sounds of approval at each display. His crest remained neutral, professional, assessing. Then they reached the human enclosure. Drothsel leaned forward, hands clasping the rail of the observation deck. His crest tilted with interest. "Terran," he said. "Quite rare." Sethal Nur allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, carefully controlled. Acquired from a salvage trader 18 cycles ago. The trader had recovered survivors from a crashed colony vessel in the outer sectors. Survivors? There were several. This one was the healthiest. The others were damaged beyond rehabilitation. Below them, Dren sat near his shelter. He had been sitting there when they arrived, and he remained still now, hands resting on his knees, face turned slightly upward, watching them. Drothsel studied the human with the evaluative gaze of someone who had seen many specimens, but few like this. "Clever hands, these Terrans," he said. "I have read the survey reports. They built structures on their worlds before contact. Complex structures. Functional architecture. Tool use. Organized labor." Sethal Nur's crest flattened almost imperceptibly. "Instinct," he said. "Not intellect. They manipulate materials the way certain insects construct hives. Pattern behavior, not reasoning. This one has demonstrated nesting adaptation to temperature change. Nothing more. And its temperament? Docile." Sethal Nur gestured toward the enclosure with one thin hand. "No aggression, no resistance, no attempts to breach containment. It accepts feeding schedules, follows predictable routines, shows no signs of psychological distress. A model specimen." Drothsel made a low sound of consideration. "Has it vocalized?" "Not once. Survey records indicate Terrans are capable of complex vocal communication, but this one has remained silent since acquisition. I suspect trauma from the capture process may have suppressed communicative instinct. Or perhaps it has nothing to say to its captors." Sethal Nur's crest twitched, then stilled. "A fanciful interpretation. Perhaps." Drothsel turned from the rail. "You may wish to publish your observations. The Bureau finds Terran behavioral data valuable. so few specimens survive acquisition intact. I intend to publish once I have gathered sufficient material. They watched for another 10 minutes. Dren did not move. He sat with his hands on his knees, breathing slowly, eyes forward. The perfect image of passive captivity. Drathsel departed before evening meal. Sethal Nur returned to his study and composed his log entry for the day. Credential review completed successfully. Colleague expressed interest in Terran's specimen. Subject displayed ideal passive behavior during observation period. No signs of awareness regarding external visitors. Collection status reaffirmed. He was pleased. The artificial sky dimmed to black. Dren waited. He had been counting drone intervals for days. 4 drones, rotating coverage, 18-minute cycles. The gap at the western drainage point lasted 43 seconds, every 3rd rotation. Tonight was a 3rd rotation. He lay in his nest until the 3rd drone passed overhead, its sensors sweeping the central area of the enclosure. Then he moved. Quick, but not hurried. He crossed the open ground to the stream, following a path he had walked dozens of times, nothing unusual in his movement. He crouched beside the water and waited. 2nd drone, eastern arc. It passed without pause. He moved to the drainage groove and followed it to the base of the rock formation. The crack was there, narrow and dark, barely visible in the dim light. The observation node above was angled toward the stream. He was in the blind spot. 43 seconds. He pulled the sharp stone from where he had hidden it beneath a loose rock. He pressed it against the edge of the crack and scraped. The stone bit into the artificial material. Fragments came away, small and pale. He worked in silence, controlled movements, no wasted energy. Scrape, twist, scrape. The crack widened by a fraction. 20 seconds left. He brushed the debris into the drainage groove and watched the water carry it away. He replaced the stone beneath the loose rock and stood. He walked back to his shelter as the 3rd drone completed its cycle. Normal movement, expected behavior. He slept. The next night he did it again. And the night after. And the night after that. By the 6th night, the crack was wide enough to fit his hand through. He reached into the darkness and felt open space beyond. Cool air rising from below. The walls of a cavity, rough and natural, not engineered. A passage. He withdrew his hand and looked up at the artificial sky, at the pale blue glow that was meant to comfort him, meant to make him feel contained and provided for. The alien believed he owned a pet. The pet was building a door. Sethal Nur reviewed weekly footage summaries in his study, attention divided between the display and his evening meal. The Terran's routines appeared unchanged. Perimeter walks in the morning, feeding at scheduled intervals, rest periods in the shelter, occasional exploration of vegetation near the stream. He flagged nothing for detailed review. The subject was stable. The collection was in order. He closed the file and moved on to more interesting matters. In the enclosure below, hidden by the curve of the rock formation, the crack was now wide enough to fit a shoulder through. Dren Calloway sat beside his shelter in the dim light of night cycle. His hands were raw, split across both palms. He kept them hidden when the drones passed. Beneath the floor of his cage, the darkness waited. Dren waited until the 3rd rotation passed, then slipped through the crack. The stone scraped against his shoulders as he pushed through. He had widened it enough to squeeze through, but now he saw it wasn't enough. His chest compressed. His breath came short. For a moment he was stuck, wedged between the artificial floor of his cage and the raw stone beneath, panic flickering at the edge of his mind. He pushed harder. The stone yielded. He tumbled forward into darkness. Cool air surrounded him. The smell of deep earth, Mineral and damp filled his lungs. He lay still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust, letting his heart slow. Darkness, but not complete darkness. Faint luminescence clung to the walls. Fungal growth, perhaps, or mineral deposits that caught and held trace light. Enough to see shapes, enough to see that he was in a passage, natural stone, rough and uneven, sloping downward into the deeper black. He stood. The ceiling was low but passable. The walls were close but not confining. He could move. He moved. The passage descended for 20 meters, then opened into a larger space. A cavern, the ceiling lost in shadow above, the floor uneven but solid. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a slow rhythm that echoed off the stone. The air was cool and clean, untouched by the recycled atmosphere of the enclosure above. Dren explored carefully. He found a stream, narrow but steady, cutting through the cavern floor. He found fungal clusters growing on the walls, pale and soft, some of them large enough to fill his palm. He did not eat them. He didn't know what was safe. He found no end to the cavern. Passages branched off in multiple directions, each leading deeper, each unexplored. A world beneath the world. He checked his internal count. 40 minutes since he had entered. The drone cycle above would complete soon. He needed to return. He climbed back through the passage, squeezed through the crack, and emerged into his enclosure as the artificial sky began to lighten toward morning cycle. He walked to his shelter, sat down, and waited for the feeding dispenser to activate. His hands were filthy with cave dust. He washed them in the stream before the first drone passed. Sethal Nur reviewed the overnight footage that afternoon. The Terran had slept in its nest, risen at dawn, followed its usual routine. Nothing unusual. Nothing flagged. He closed the file without any comment. Dren began living two lives. Above, he was the docile pet. He walked his perimeter. He ate his nutrient blocks. He sat in his shelter and watched the observation deck with empty patience. When Sethal Nur visited, Dren remained still, compliant, unremarkable. Below, he was an explorer. He mapped the cavern system over many nights. The main chamber connected to a network of passages, some narrow enough to require crawling, others wide enough to walk 3 abreast. He found more water sources, underground streams fed by moisture seeping through the moon's crust. He found more fungal growth, different varieties in different chambers, some luminescent, some dark, some with textures that suggested they might be edible. He tested the fungi carefully, small amounts, waiting hours for reactions. Most caused nothing. A few caused stomach cramps that lasted a day. 2 varieties seemed safe, bland but filling, and he began harvesting them. He brought supplies below, nutrient blocks saved from his meals, hidden in his nest, until he could carry them through the crack. Fragments of the thermal sheet, torn into strips that could be woven or used for insulation. Stones with useful shapes. Plant fibers from the enclosure vegetation. The underground became a second home, a real home. Seasons passed in the enclosure above. Sethal Nur adjusted the environment periodically, testing his specimens' responses. Temperature drops, humidity increases. Once, a reduction in feeding that lasted 3 days. Dren adapted to each change without complaint, showing no visible distress, never revealing that he was supplementing his diet with pale fungus grown in darkness. The scientist logged each adjustment and each response. Subject demonstrates consistent adaptive capacity, resilience within expected parameters, no behavioral anomalies. He did not know that his specimen spent 4 hours each night in caverns he had never mapped, building something he could not imagine. Dren found the first sign on a night when the artificial sky had been dark for 3 hours. He was exploring a new passage, one that branched westward from the main chamber and descended steeply through fractured rock. The walls here were different, marked by old geological stress, cracks running through the stone in patterns that spoke of ancient pressure and release. On one wall, at shoulder height, he found scratches, not natural, too regular. Lines carved into the stone, 4 vertical marks crossed by a diagonal like a tally. Someone had been counting. Human marks? Dren went still. His heart beat against his ribs. He traced the scratches with his fingers, feeling the grooves, estimating their age. Old. Months old, at least. Maybe longer. He moved deeper into the passage. More signs. A torn piece of fabric caught on a rock projection, faded and frayed, but unmistakably woven. A scattering of bones in a side chamber, small animals, stripped clean and discarded. The remains of meals. Someone had been here. Someone human. He found them 2 nights later. The passage opened into a cavern larger than any he had discovered. The ceiling vaulted high enough that the luminescent fungus on the walls cast only dim light across the floor. A stream ran through the center, wider than the others, deep enough to hold fish-like creatures that darted away from his approach. And near the stream, huddled around a small fire that burned with pale flame, 3 figures looked up at his arrival. Humans! 2 men, and silence stretched between them for a long moment. Dren stood at the edge of the firelight, hands visible, posture non-threatening. The others watched him with eyes that held fear and hope and the hard wariness of survivors. The older man spoke first. His voice was rough, unused to speech. Which estate? Dren understood the question. Sethal Nur, Eastern Ridge. The older man nodded slowly. Collector. Mid-rank. We know of him. He gestured to the younger man beside him. Fen escaped from Torath Nal, 3 ridges south. I came from a facility near the pole. Research station. They did not want pets there. They wanted test subjects. He left it at that. He didn't need to say more. How long? Dren asked. I stopped counting after 2 years. Fen has been free for 8 months. We found each other by accident. The caverns connect. Most of the estates sit above the same network. The older man studied Dren with careful attention. You move well for someone recently escaped. How long have you been below? I have not escaped. I return to the enclosure each night. The collector does not know I leave. The older man's expression shifted. Something like respect entered his eyes. You maintain the illusion. For now. Clever. The older man extended a hand. I am Garrett Osmond. Before capture, I was a structural engineer on Corin 4. Dren took the hand. Dren Calloway. Mining engineer. Same colony. The younger man, Fen, spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, tense. The colony ship crash. We were on the same ship. Likely. I do not remember the capture. Only the shaft collapsed before it. Garrett nodded slowly. There were many survivors on that ship. The Othani took them from the wreckage, sold them to collectors across this region. Most didn't last long. The others, he shook his head. Some are still in enclosures. Some died in them. A few found the cracks. How many? Dren asked. How many are free? Here, 3, now that you have come. But there are others, scattered through the network. We find signs of them sometimes. Marks on walls, abandoned camps. Some move constantly, afraid of being found. Some have settled in deeper chambers. Garrett paused. None of us have organized. None of us have tried to build something larger than survival. Dren looked at the fire, at the stream, at the vast darkness of the cavern around them. He looked at the 2 men who had survived captivity and found their way to freedom, and had been waiting here in the dark for something they could not name. "Then we start now," he said. The work began slowly. Dren continued his double life, each day in the enclosure, each night below. He brought information down with him: drone patterns, observation gaps, the timing of Seth al-Nur's visits, the structure of the systems that kept him contained. Garrett and Fenn listened and asked questions and shared what they knew in return. The cavern network was vast, extending beneath dozens of estates, a natural formation the Othani had never fully mapped because they never needed to. Their enclosures sat on the surface, their sensors reaching only as far as the artificial floors. The rock below was dense and mineral-rich, thick enough to scatter most scans. Whatever lay beneath it didn't exist to Othani sensors. They began organizing. Water sources were mapped and marked. The safest passages were identified and memorized. Fungal farms were established in chambers with the right humidity. The pale growth cultivated and harvested in rotation. Tools were crafted from stone and bone, and the occasional piece of salvaged material that Dren brought from above. Fenn had been a fabricator before capture. His hands remembered how to shape things. He made knives from sharpened stone, containers from hollowed rock, rope from woven plant fibers that Dren smuggled from his enclosure. Crude tools, functional tools. Garrett planned. He drew maps in the dust, traced routes through the network, calculated distances and resources, and the logistics of survival. His mind worked in systems, in structures, in the patient accumulation of small advantages. Dren moved between worlds. He maintained the illusion above with perfect discipline. He sat in his shelter and watched the drones pass. He ate his nutrient blocks and drank his water and showed nothing on his face when Seth al-Nur stood on the observation deck and made notes in his log. And each night, he slipped through the crack and descended into the dark and helped build something the Othani could not see. Seth al-Nur noticed the anomaly on a routine review cycle. The Terran's weight had dropped, not significantly. A small percentage, within normal variance, but consistent across 3 measurement periods. The subject was eating the same amount, following the same routines, showing no signs of illness or distress. Yet the mass readings from the shelter floor sensors told a different story. He reviewed the footage more carefully. The Terran sat. The Terran walked. The Terran ate. Nothing unusual. Nothing to explain the discrepancy. His crest tilted forward, then flattened. Uncertainty. He did not like uncertainty. He increased observation frequency. 2 additional drone passes per cycle. A new sensor node installed near the shelter. He adjusted the enclosure temperature downward, testing for stress response. The Terran adapted. It reinforced its nest, gathered additional insulation, showed no distress. Expected adaptive behavior. But the weight continued to drop. Seth al-Nur sat in his study that evening, crest movements betraying an unease he did not consciously acknowledge. The numbers did not align. The data did not explain itself. Somewhere in his subject's behavior, there was a variable he was not measuring. He made a log entry. Minor anomaly in subject metrics. Weight reduction of 3% over 2 cycles, despite consistent nutrition intake. Cause unclear. No visible behavioral changes. He flagged the subject for increased attention, but took no direct action. The anomaly was small. The subject was stable. There was no evidence of anything beyond normal variance. He closed the file and moved to other matters. Below the enclosure, in a cavern he would never see, 17 humans gathered around a fire and listened as Drian Calloway explained the patrol patterns of the drones above. The settlement grew. Others found their way to the main cavern over the following months. Humans who had escaped other enclosures, following passages through the dark. drawn by rumors of a gathering place. Some came alone, some came in pairs. Each brought skills, knowledge, the hard-won wisdom of survival in captivity. A woman named Sarah Thorne had been a botanist. She studied the fungal varieties with careful attention and identified 3 more species that were safe to eat. 2 had medicinal properties, and 1 was toxic and should be avoided. She established cultivation protocols and taught others to maintain the farms. A man named Colum Braddock had been a security officer on the colony ship. He organized patrols, established watch rotations, created protocols for movement through the network that minimized risk of discovery. A young man named Thomas had been barely 16 when captured. He remembered little of his life before, but he learned quickly, worked hard, and never complained. He became a messenger, moving between camps through passages too narrow for adults, carrying information through the dark. Dren did not declare himself leader. He did not seek authority. But when questions arose, people looked to him. When decisions needed to be made, his voice carried weight. He had been the first to organize, the first to propose building rather than merely surviving. That meant something. The settlement developed structure, sleeping quarters in dry chambers, storage areas for preserved food, a central fire that burned constantly, fed by fungal matter that released heat without smoke. Water drawn from the underground stream filtered through layers of sand and stone. Tools improved. Fen taught others to shape stone, to weave fiber, to build simple machines for grinding and cutting. The first metal appeared when someone found a vein of copper ore in a deep passage, and Dren remembered enough from his mining days to extract it. They made knives with copper edges, needles for sewing, hooks for fishing the pale creatures that swam in the underground streams. Above, the enclosures continued their quiet routines. The Othani collectors fed their pets and logged their observations and noticed nothing. The drones patrolled, the sensors recorded, the barriers held. But beneath the surface, invisible to every instrument the aliens possessed, something was growing. Years passed by. In the dark, a city was built and never named. Dren Calloway walked through the central passage, his footsteps echoing off walls that had been carved by human hands over many years. He was old. Gray had spread through his hair and into his beard. His hands were thick with scars, the skin cracked and calloused from decades of work. His shoulders ached in the cold. His knees protested the long walks. But he walked anyway, every day, because the city needed to see him moving through it, not as a leader. He had never claimed that title, but as proof that they had survived. The passage opened into the main chamber, and Dren paused to look at what they had made. The cavern stretched 300 meters from end to end. The ceiling rose high enough that the luminescent fungus on the walls cast a soft blue glow across everything, a false sky that the children called the nightlight. Stone structures lined the chamber floor, living quarters with doorways hung with woven fabric, workshops where the sound of hammering echoed at all hours, a great hall where the council met to make decisions. Water flowed through channels cut into the floor, diverted from the underground streams, filtered and distributed to every section of the city. Fungal farms grew in side chambers, tended by workers who understood the cycles of growth and harvest. Copper tools hung in the workshops, gleaming dull orange in the blue light. Rope bridges crossed the wider gaps where the floor had been too difficult to level. And everywhere, people. Hundreds of them now. Men and women who had escaped enclosures across the region, finding their way through the tunnel network, drawn by word of mouth and the marks left on cavern walls. Their children, born below, who had never seen an artificial sky or felt a barrier's resistance. their children's children, the third generation, who knew the Othani only as stories told by elders. A girl ran past Dren, chasing a younger boy through the passage. She was perhaps 7 years old. She had never been a pet. She had never been owned. She did not know what it meant to sit in a cage and wait for food to be dispensed. She only knew the city. Dren watched her disappear around a corner, then continued walking. He still returned to the enclosure. Not every night, not even every week, but often enough to maintain the illusion for any observation that might still be active. He was too old to squeeze through the original crack now. They had widened it years ago, carved a proper passage with steps and handholds, concealed the entrance with a stone cover that blended with the enclosure floor. Sithal Nur had long since adjusted his expectations. Aging specimens moved less. They spent more time in their shelters, conserving energy, following slower routines. The absence was not suspicious. It was predictable. Dren used that. He climbed up that passage now, his knees protesting each step, and emerged into the space that had been his cage for so many years. The vegetation had grown wild without his maintenance. The streams still flowed, the water still drained. The artificial sky still glowed with its pale blue light. The barrier was still active. The drones still patrolled. But Sithal Nur rarely visited the observation deck anymore. Years had passed since the scientist had shown more than routine interest in his aging specimen. The pet was old, docile, stable. A long-term success, hardly worth watching. Dren sat beside the shelter and let the drones see him. He sat for an hour, patient as he had always been, then descended back into the city. The illusion held. The breach happened by accident. A tunnel expansion team was working on a new passage, extending the network toward the western estates, where reports suggested more humans might still be held. They were following a natural fissure in the rock, widening it enough to walk through when the lead excavator's copper pick broke through into open space. Not another cavern, something else. The team leader sent for Dren. He arrived an hour later, accompanied by Garrett Osmond, who still served as the city's chief engineer, despite the years that had bent his back and whitened his hair. They crawled through the narrow passage and emerged into the breach. A corridor, smooth walls, artificial lighting, dim but functional. Power conduits running along the ceiling, communication lines bundled in protective channels, the hum of machinery somewhere in the distance. Othani infrastructure. Garrett ran his fingers along the wall, his old engineer's instincts reading the construction. Maintenance access, he said quietly. This runs beneath the estates. Power distribution, communication routing, environmental controls. Dren looked down the corridor in both directions. Empty. Silent. No sensors visible, no security systems active. The Othani had built this to service their surface facilities. They had never expected anyone to access it from below. The enclosures, Dren said. The barriers. The drones. They all run on power. Garrett nodded slowly. Cut the conduits, and everything above goes dark. They stood in silence for a long moment, understanding the weight of what they had found. Not just one estate, Garrett said. This is a trunk line. It services the entire region. Dozens of estates. Hundreds of enclosures. Dren thought of the humans still held above, still sitting in their cages, still waiting for food to be dispensed, still believing they were alone. We need to bring this to the council, he said. The debate lasted 3 days. Too much had been built in the dark to risk it lightly. Voices rose and fell, not in anger, but in the steady friction of people who understood exactly what they stood to lose. Some spoke of caution, of patience, of the years it had taken to carve a life out of stone and silence. Others spoke of the surface, of the ones still waiting, still sitting in cages without knowing there was anything else. Dren listened to both sides. He let everyone speak. He did not interrupt, did not argue, did not try to sway the discussion. When the voices finally fell silent, the council turned to him. He stood slowly, his old joints protesting. He looked around the chamber at the faces that watched him, men and women who had escaped captivity, the entire span of what they had become. "I was the first," he said. "The first to find the crack, the first to go below. I did not know what I would find. I did not know if I would survive. But I went anyway, because staying in the cage was not living." He paused, letting the words settle. "There are humans above who are still in cages. They do not know we exist. They don't know freedom is possible. We can give them what we found. We can open their cages and show them the way down." He looked at the council members who had argued for caution. "Yes, there is risk. Yes, the Othani will respond. But we are not hiding forever. We are building something. And what we build must include everyone we can reach." The vote was not unanimous. The operation was approved. They moved 1 week after the decision. Teams had spent the intervening days mapping the maintenance corridor, identifying junction points, planning routes. Fenn built the tools for cutting power conduits. Colin Braddock organized the teams and drilled them until timing became instinct. Dren insisted on leading the primary team himself. They entered the corridor through the breach, moving in silence, their footsteps soft on the smooth floor. 12 teams total, spreading through the network to reach junction points across the region. Communication was impossible once they separated. Each team knew its target and its timing. Success depended on coordination. Dren's team reached their junction point with minutes to spare, a nexus where multiple conduits converged before splitting toward the eastern estates. Sethal Nur's estate among them. He checked the time marker on his wrist, a simple device Fenn had built from salvaged components. The moment came. He gave the signal. Copper blades bit into power conduits. Sparks flew and died. The hum of machinery stuttered and stopped. Communication lines were severed with quick cuts. The corridor went dark. Above, across the region, enclosures went dark with it. Barriers flickered and fell. Drones dropped from the air, their power sources dead. Environmental controls shut down. Feeding dispensers went silent. Observation nodes recorded nothing but blackness. The cages opened. Sethal Nur woke to alarms. Red light pulsed through his sleeping chamber. Warning tones blared from every surface. He rose quickly, his crest flaring with alarm, and accessed his estate's monitoring system. Nothing. The feeds were dead. The sensors were offline. The entire network had collapsed. He moved through his estate with increasing urgency, checking system after system, finding only darkness and silence. The other specimens in his collection were agitated, their habitats disrupted by the power failure, but they were contained by physical barriers that did not require power. Heavy enclosures designed for creatures that relied on strength, instinct, or panic. The Terran enclosure had never required that level of containment. It was controlled by systems, by routines, by assumption. And now those systems were gone. He reached the observation deck and looked down. The barrier was gone. The shimmer in the air had vanished. The enclosure lay open, unprotected, accessible. The space beside the shelter where his pet usually sat was empty. Sethal Nur's gaze shifted to the structure. The entrance stood open. No movement inside. No heat signature returned from the internal scan. The Terran was not there. Sethal Nur crest moved through configurations he could not control. Confusion. Disbelief. The beginning of something he had never felt while looking at that enclosure. Fear. He descended from the observation deck and moved through corridors he had never needed to walk. He reached the ground level and stepped through the fallen barrier into the enclosure itself. The vegetation brushed against his thin legs. The artificial stream burbled past his feet. The shelter stood silent and empty, the thermal sheet still folded in its corner, the dispenser still mounted in its wall. He searched the enclosure with attention. The drainage groove, intact, unchanged. The rock formation at the western edge. He stopped. The surface there was not solid. He moved closer. A seam, an opening, a passage cut into the floor, descending into darkness. He stood there for a moment, looking into it. He should call for support. He should report the breach. He should wait for security forces to arrive and investigate properly. Instead, he entered the passage. The descent took longer than he expected. The passage was narrow but navigable. Steps had been carved into the stone, worn smooth by countless feet. The walls were marked with symbols he did not recognize, scratched into the rock at regular intervals. Guides, markers, a system, an organization. He emerged into a cavern and stopped. Light. Not artificial light from Othani technology, but soft blue luminescence from fungal growth on the walls. The glow revealed a space larger than his entire estate. Stone structures filled the cavern floor. Water channels cut through the rock. Bridges spanned gaps in the terrain. Workshops, living quarters. A great hall with pillars carved from natural stone. A city, and everywhere, humans. They stopped what they were doing as he emerged. Hundreds of faces turned toward him, men and women with calloused hands and steady eyes. Children who stared at him without fear, only curiosity. Guards with copper weapons who moved to intercept him and then stopped at a gesture from someone deeper in the crowd. The crowd parted. A human walked toward him. Old, gray hair, gray beard, weathered skin covered in scars, hands thick with decades of labor, eyes that held no hatred, no triumph, no fear. Patient eyes. Familiar eyes. His pet. Dren stopped 3 meters from the alien and waited. Sethal Nur's crest was moving rapidly. Fear, confusion, awe, cycling through expressions the alien could not suppress. His four-fingered hands trembled at his sides. His dark eyes moved across the city, trying to process what he was seeing, failing. When he finally spoke, his voice was unsteady. How long? Dren considered the question. How long since he had first scraped at the crack with a sharp stone? How long since he had squeezed through into the darkness? How long since he had found Garrett and Fenn by their fire and decided to build something larger than survival? Since the beginning, he said. Sethal Nur's crest flattened. Something shifted in his expression, the realization settling in, heavy and final. He had never owned a pet. He had incubated a civilization. Every observation he had made, every log entry he had written, every satisfied note about his docile specimen had been meaningless. The Terran had been building this while Sethal Nur watched and saw nothing. His systems were down. His protocols were useless. He had no power here, no authority, no control. He was standing in a city that should not exist, surrounded by humans who owed him nothing but their captivity. Dren watched the alien process this. He felt no satisfaction, no triumph, only a quiet acknowledgement that this moment had always been coming. You have a choice, Dren said. Leave. Climb back through the passage. Return to your estate. Tell the others what you have seen. He paused, or stay, and watch what comes next. Sethal Nur looked at him for a moment. The crest stilled. Something like understanding crossed his alien features. He turned and walked back toward the passage. Dren watched him go. Sethal Nur emerged from the passage into the gray light of dawn. The artificial sky had reset to its morning cycle, running on fragmented backup systems, casting pale blue across the enclosure. The shelter stood silent. The stream continued its flow. The vegetation moved in a wind that no longer followed proper patterns. Nothing was as it should be. He climbed the stairs to the observation deck and looked down, and he saw them. Figures crossing the perimeter from every direction. Not Othani, not drones. Humans. They moved without hesitation. Some carried tools. Others carried weapons. Crude but deliberate. They spread quickly, not gathering, not pausing, moving beyond the enclosure toward the neighboring estates, toward the others. Setal Nur turned. Across the ridge, other enclosures were opening. He could see movement in the distance, shapes emerging where none should have been. Creatures long contained, stepping into open ground for the first time. Some fled blindly. Some hesitated. Some turned on the nearest Othani they found. Confusion spread first. Then, violence. A handler ran across a distant platform, signaling, shouting into a dead system. Something large broke through a weakened barrier behind him. The sound carried even at this distance. The shouting stopped. Elsewhere, structures were being abandoned. Access ramps extended. Transport bays opened. The pattern became clear. The estates were being left. Ships began to rise. Setal Nur watched as one vessel tore free of the ground and climbed into the sky, followed by another and another. What had been built here was coming apart, not in chaos, but in quiet abandonment. The Othani were not a brutal species. They had never thought of themselves that way. They had believed in order, in classification, in the careful management of lesser forms of life. Humans had been placed within that understanding, contained, observed, sustained. Not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. They had been wrong. What moved across the surface now did not fit within any model they had trusted. The structures that had defined control were failing, one after another, and what replaced them was not something the Othani were made to confront. They did not wage war over broken systems. They did not fight for what they no longer understood. So they left. Below, humans continued to move. They moved from enclosure to enclosure, opening what remained, guiding what they could, leaving what they could not control to its own outcome. This was not a single escape. It was a release. Setal Nur stood at the rail for a moment longer. Then he turned and left it behind. He moved through corridors that no longer responded to him, through systems that no longer recognized his authority. By the time he reached the transport bay, other estate owners were already there. They boarded in silence. The vessel lifted. Below, the surface no longer belonged to the ones who had built it. The cages had opened, and nothing was going back inside.